Hey guys, tonight we begin with a creature who shaped human history more than half the kings we've ever had, the dog. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Ice Age was not a magical snowy landscape where everyone learns about friendship. It was a frozen nightmare designed by nature's most sadistic intern. Temperatures tried to kill you. Predators tried to kill you. Even your own campfire sometimes tried to kill you by collapsing into your lap. Humanity survived out of stubbornness, bad decision-making, and the occasional lucky accident. One of those accidents began the greatest friendship in history. Imagine yourself wrapped in animal skins that smell like regret and mildew, sitting beside a fire that barely deserves to be called warm. Your entire clan looks like a group of exhausted raccoons wearing hats made of other raccoons. Dinner is a chunk of mammoth meat so burnt it qualifies as charcoal. Spirits are low. Hygiene is non-existent. Hope is a distant myth. Then you hear it. A low growl from the darkness. Not subtle, not friendly. The kind of growl that says, "I am considering eating you and your shoes." It's wolves, because of course it is. Wolves have been watching your camp all day, judging your hunting skills, which are terrible. They see you as a walking disappointment with a pulse. But tonight, something unusual happens. From the shadows steps the world's least successful wolf, a scrawny, socially awkward, bottom-of-the-pack reject. The kind of wolf who gets bullied by squirrels. He's starving, desperate, and clearly making bad life choices, like approaching humans who have spears and anxiety. He pads closer to the firelight. Humans panic internally. The wolf sits down like he owns the place. Everyone freezes. No one wants to be the first one eaten. The wolf looks at your mammoth bone with the same expression modern dogs use when you open a bag of chips. And then, in an act of ancient stupidity that changed the world, someone throws him a scrap. Not out of kindness, not out of hope, just, maybe if he eats this, he won't eat me. The wolf grabs the scrap, trots back into the darkness, tail twitching in what might be gratitude or indigestion. The next night he returns. And the next, and the next. Soon he's sitting closer, sleeping nearby, growling at other predators like he suddenly works security for the camp. Humans tolerate him because, honestly, life is easier when something with sharp teeth is on your side. Little by little, the killer becomes the freeloader. The freeloader becomes the companion, and the creature that once hunted us becomes the first ever dog. All because two species were too cold, too hungry, and too tired to kill each other. Once the world's least intimidating wolf realized humans were basically a walking buffet of half-cooked disappointment, he brought friends. Not the cool alpha wolves, no. Those wolves had standards. These were the outcasts, the weirdos, the wolves whose own mothers sighed at them. The kind of wolves who looked at their reflection in a frozen pond and thought, "I'm trying my best." These wolves discovered humanity's greatest invention long before fire, agriculture, or the wheel, the garbage pile. To Ice Age wolves, the human trash heap was like stumbling into a Michelin star restaurant where the chef is blindfolded and hates his job. Burnt bones, meat scraps, fat trimmings. Things humans threw away because even starving people said absolutely not. Wolves loved it. To them, it was gourmet. Soon enough, these wolves began hanging around the very edges of the camp, close enough to smell the stew, which smelled like sadness, but far enough to run if someone threw a rock. It was a relationship built on fear, caution, and an extremely low bar for good cuisine. Humans, for their part, realized something magical. The wolves that stayed were the ones that didn't immediately try to remove your leg. This was a valuable trait in the Ice Age. So the dynamic evolved. Wolves approached camp. Humans gripped their spears. Wolves made their best "I'm harmless and pathetic" face. Humans sighed, tossed a bone, and muttered about how this wasn't their job. Night after night, the wolves who were the least aggressive, or the most starving, returned. And slowly, these wolves changed. Not spiritually, not philosophically. Evolution simply said, let's make these things smaller, dumber, and more appealing to humans, who clearly love a fixer-upper. Snouts shortened, eyes widened, tail wagging accidentally evolved, likely from one wolf who got too excited about leftovers and discovered it earned more leftovers. Gradually, the wolves became less, "I might eat your children," and more, "I'm here for snacks and emotional support." But the wolves weren't doing charity. They got something out of this too. Warmth from human fires, protection from larger predators, a stable food supply, assuming humans caught anything that day. Occasional mammoth jerky, because desperation makes cooks generous. Evolution had done something extraordinary. It turned a deadly predator into the world's first professional trash eater, and humans, for once, felt slightly safer. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because a wolf with no ambition decided humans were easier to live with than other wolves. Welcome to the birth of domestication, the laziest yet most successful partnership in history. Domestication wasn't a magical moment where a wolf suddenly rolled over and said, "I think I'll be adorable now." No, it was thousands of years of slow, reluctant evolution, mostly driven by hunger, laziness, and the realization that biting humans was a bad career move. At this point, the wolves hanging around human camps weren't exactly wolves anymore. They were wolf-shaped disappointments. The runts, the socially anxious, the ones who couldn't hunt, couldn't fight, and probably failed basic wolf school. If wolves had student loans, these were the ones defaulting. But these were also the wolves who discovered something revolutionary. Acting slightly less murdery gets you free food. This was the dawn of survival through cuteness. A wolf with a slightly rounder face gets more leftovers. A wolf who doesn't growl at toddlers gets invited closer to the fire. A wolf whose tail wiggles instead of thrashing in rage gets awe noises, a sound that triggers the ancient human instinct to give away snacks. And so, generation after generation, these camp wolves changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly, like a bad haircut growing out. Their skulls shrank, their teeth softened, their eyes widened into the expression scientists now classify as emotionally manipulative. Wolves became dogs the same way people become influencers, by performing harmless behavior until someone pays attention. Meanwhile, humans began to notice something else. These newly evolved proto-dogs didn't just stop attacking, they started helping. Kind of. One wolf might bark when a predator approached. Another might trail behind hunters, hoping for scraps and accidentally contributing to the hunt. A third might simply sit in camp, giving emotional support to someone who just lost a fight with a berry bush. Humans looked at these creatures, smaller than wolves, friendlier than wolves, and 10 times less competent than wolves, and thought, this one might survive if I protect it. So they did. The strong wolves died out. The cute, needy, clingy ones thrived. Evolution applauded this new strategy called being adorable, and thus the great transformation continued, from predator to scavenger, from scavenger to sidekick, from sidekick to creature that sleeps in your bed and steals half your pillow. The murder instinct faded. The feed me instinct intensified, and humanity found itself raising the world's first professional loaf-shaped companion. By the time proto-dogs had fully committed to the less murder, more mooching lifestyle, humans began to realize something shocking. These little ex-wolves were actually useful. Not very competent, not very coordinated, but useful in the way a loud, anxious roommate is useful. They might not help with chores, but they will certainly yell when something sketchy happens. Dogs became the world's first alarm systems, Picture a prehistoric night. The wind is howling, the fire is crackling, and your clan is trying to sleep through the sound of someone snoring like a dying mammoth. Suddenly, a rustle comes from the darkness. Before humans can reach their spears, one of the camp dogs erupts into frantic barking. Not brave, not heroic, just incredibly loud. Loud enough to wake the dead. Loud enough to make predators reconsider their life choices. This was revolutionary. Humans had invented nothing that could do this. The security system they had before dogs consisted of listening for trouble, hoping your ears worked. Crying dogs changed that. They barked at predators, strangers, shadows, suspicious rocks, their own tail. Basically, anything they decided was terrifying at the moment. And although prehistoric humans had many problems, sleep deprivation from dog barking was probably their first shared universal experience. But dogs weren't just noise machines. They were territorial. They adopted the camp as their domain. The same wolf who once considered humans trail mix with limbs now patrolled around the fire like an overworked bouncer. Humans appreciated this. They rewarded it with scraps, pets, pats, and constant enabling, the same dynamic that still exists between dogs and humans today. Soon, dogs discovered another superpower, tracking things better than humans ever could. They could smell predators before humans even sensed danger. They could tell the difference between harmless noises and something that actually wanted to eat you. And though dogs rarely fought predators directly, bravery was still a work in progress. They excelled at loudly announcing danger and then bravely hiding behind humans. And humans, for their part, began viewing these messy, needy, tail-wagging creatures not as wild animals, but as allies. Dogs weren't perfect. They still stole food. They still made bad choices. They still panicked at absolutely nothing. But for the first time in prehistory, humans had something watching their backs, something loyal, something protective, something that, occasionally, did the right thing on purpose. The Ice Age was still brutal. But now, humans didn't face the darkness alone. By now, early dogs weren't just scavengers or furry alarm clocks. They were becoming partners on the most miserable team sport in human history, Ice Age hunting. A sport where the rules were simple: catch something or starve. Preferably catch something that won't immediately catch you back. Humans were decent hunters, sure. They had spears, teamwork, and the ability to complain loudly about everything. But dogs? Dogs had superpowers. Noses that could detect prey from miles away, ears that twitched at the faintest snap of a twig, and energy levels that made humans seriously reconsider their own stamina. A typical hunt went something like this. Humans spot a herd of something large, angry, and equipped with horns capable of rearranging your skeletal system. Dogs notice it too, usually before humans, then start barking like unpaid interns desperate to impress their boss. The noise startles the prey, which either runs away or charges forward, depending on the animal's mood and sense of humour. The dogs sprint ahead, fueled by excitement, adrenaline, and absolutely no thoughts whatsoever. Humans follow behind, fueled by hunger, fear, and the knowledge that their winter coat is literally falling apart. Together, they form the world's first dysfunctional hunting party. Surprisingly, it works. Dogs chase prey into traps. Dogs flush animals from hiding spots. Dogs track wounded creatures through forests humans would get lost in instantly. Dogs do all the dangerous legwork, while humans show up at the end and throw spears like they contributed equally. And the best part? Dogs think this is fun. They have no concept of risk assessment. They don't understand fatal consequences. They're just thrilled to be involved in anything that isn't freezing to death or barking at a leaf. Of course, not every dog was a born hunter. Some dogs got distracted by butterflies. Some chased the wrong animal for 2 hours. Some ran off entirely and returned with a stick, proudly convinced they'd solved hunger forever. But humans tolerated all of this, because even the stupidest dog occasionally helped catch something edible. Ice Age hunting with dogs wasn't perfect, but it was better, faster, more successful, and most importantly, It bonded humans and dogs in shared triumph and shared trauma. There's nothing like being nearly trampled by a mammoth together to build trust. And slowly, humans began to realize these creatures weren't just useful. They were becoming essential. Partners, companions, something dangerously close to friends. Somewhere between barking at predators and chasing mammoths with questionable enthusiasm, dogs crossed a line. They moved in. Not in a formal, sign this lease agreement way, more in a, I'm cold, you're warm, and this arrangement benefits me more than you way. And humans, worn down by the Ice Age and poor decision-making, let it happen. Originally, dogs slept near the edges of campfires. Not too close. Humans smelled weird and made unpredictable noises in their sleep, but close enough to enjoy the heat. Then, one especially bold dog decided he was tired of frostbite and simply walked into a human shelter like he owned the place. Humans stared. The dog stared back. Then he curled up in the corner and acted like this was completely normal. And just like that, humanity lost the living room. At first, only a few dogs did this. The bravest, the dumbest, the ones who confused danger with opportunity. But soon enough, more followed. They realized humans had invented blankets. Primitive, smelly blankets, yes, but soft enough compared to sleeping on frozen dirt. Humans protested at first. They complained. They pushed the dogs away. And then, when the temperature dropped to, "Why are we alive?" they reluctantly pulled the dogs closer. Nothing warms a frigid shelter like a 50-pound fluffy space heater that occasionally snores. This was the moment everything changed. Dogs started treating human camps as their dens. They guarded them without being asked. They growled at strangers, barked at weird noises, and woke everyone up at 3 a.m. because a pine cone moved in a threatening way. Humans didn't realize it yet, but the domestication process was complete. The dogs weren't living with humans. The humans were living with dogs. Dogs claimed the warmest sleeping spots. Dogs ate the best scraps. Dogs inserted themselves into family matters like furry diplomats. Dogs decided who could approach the camp and who couldn't. Dogs even tried to help with chores, which mostly resulted in chaos, but was appreciated nonetheless. And the strangest part, humans didn't hate it. Despite the fur everywhere, the constant barking, the occasional stolen food, and the fact that dogs absolutely did not respect personal space, humans grew attached. Emotionally. Deeply. Because dogs did something no Ice Age human expected. They made life less miserable. The nights didn't feel so long. The cold felt less cruel. And for the first time in human history, someone greeted you with joy simply because you existed. The partnership was sealed. Not by blood, not by ritual, but by warmth, leftovers, and loneliness. As the Ice Age thawed and humanity collectively decided it preferred not dying of frostbite, civilization finally sprouted. And with it, dogs strutted right into the spotlight like they were auditioning for a historical documentary. And nowhere did they shine brighter than ancient Egypt, the land of gold, gods, pyramids, and an alarming enthusiasm for shaving things. Egyptians took one look at dogs and said, yes, this creature clearly has divine potential. Which is funny considering dogs were still rolling in questionable substances and eating whatever fell on the ground. But the Egyptians admired loyalty, courage, and a good set of teeth, qualities dogs had in abundance, unlike half the royal court. Dogs guarded homes, herded livestock, and accompanied hunters into marshes filled with hippos, crocodiles, and birds who looked like they held grudges. Egyptian hunters trusted their dogs more than their fellow nobles, and honestly, who could blame them? But Egypt took dog appreciation to new heights. Literally. They immortalized dogs in tomb paintings. They carved dogs into statues. They painted them on pottery. Some nobles even had their dogs buried beside them so they could continue peeing on sacred objects in the afterlife. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death, embalming. And please don't haunt me. Egyptians claimed he wasn't technically based on dogs. But let's be honest. Ancient Egyptian jackals looked suspiciously like street dogs with eyeliner. The divine message was clear. Dogs were respected, feared, loved, and rumoured to work part-time guiding souls into the underworld. Despite all this worship, Egyptians also had a terrible habit. They shaved their dogs. Not for cleanliness or health reasons, but because bald dogs were considered fashionable. Imagine a majestic hunting dog, proud and skilled, suddenly shaved until it resembled a confused, shivering rat with existential questions. That was Egyptian style. Still, dogs in Egypt lived better lives than most peasants. They had names, they had collars, they had fan art. Some even had funerals more elaborate than your average taxpayer. If reincarnation is real, you definitely wanted to come back as an Egyptian noble's dog, not his servant. In Egypt, dogs were no longer just camp companions. They were symbols of protection, friendship, loyalty, and the universal truth. Dogs were already our best friends. Humans were just finally catching up. By the time dogs reached ancient Greece, they had survived the Ice Age, found religion in Egypt, and were now ready to deal with something far more stressful: Greek philosophers. Wolves had once faced mammoths. Dogs had once faced starvation. But nothing prepared them for a toga-wearing intellectual trying to explain ethics for 6 hours straight. In Greece, dogs were everywhere. In workshops, marketplaces, gymnasiums. Yes, Greeks exercised a lot. And most importantly, in philosophical schools. And if you're wondering what dogs were doing there, the answer is simple: sleeping through lectures. Dogs have always understood that the correct response to a man explaining the nature of truth is to take a nap. Yet the Greeks admired dogs. Deeply. They saw dogs as symbols of loyalty, bravery, and moral clarity. Everything the average Athenian citizen lacked. Greek warriors used dogs for protection. Farmers used them to guard flocks. Hunters used them to chase down prey. And philosophers used them as metaphors because apparently no discussion of virtue was complete without mentioning a good boy. But the funniest part? There was an entire philosophical movement named after dogs. The Cynics. The word cynic literally means dog-like. Not because they were loyal. No, because they lived simply, barked at society's nonsense, refused to follow rules, and occasionally peed in public to make a point. Dogs would have been proud. Socrates praised dogs for their ability to tell friend from enemy. Plato compared dogs to ideal guardians. Aristotle claimed dogs had a form of practical wisdom, which is ironic considering this was an era when dogs still ate rocks for fun. Meanwhile, Greek households adored their dogs and treated them surprisingly well. They gave them names like Foxy, Whitey, Growler, and Blitzer, proving that humans have always been bad at naming things. Dogs lounged in courtyards, begged for food in tavern entrances, and inserted themselves into family life with zero boundaries. But Greek dogs also had jobs. Real jobs. They guarded temples. They herded goats. They accompanied soldiers into battle, something Socrates politely declined to do. They even protected entire city gates at night, barking at suspicious noises and occasionally at absolutely nothing, continuing a proud tradition still practiced today. In the classical world, dogs weren't just companions. They were co-workers, bodyguards, sleep aids for bored philosophers, and furry symbols of everything humans wanted to be but rarely achieved. And the Greeks understood one thing better than anyone. Dogs live simply, love deeply, and judge silently, which makes them wiser than most philosophers. When dogs reached ancient Rome, they discovered something terrifying. An empire that tried to militarize absolutely everything. If Rome could weaponize it, it did. If it couldn't weaponize it, Rome conquered it anyway and wrote a manual about why weaponizing it was a great idea. Naturally, dogs didn't escape this treatment. Romans looked at dogs, loyal, fast, and emotionally available, and said, "Yes, perfect, let's put armor on it." Enter the Roman war dog, an animal who did not sign up for this job. These dogs, often mastiffs or massive Molossian breeds, marched alongside legions, wearing spiked collars and occasionally chainmail. Imagine being a barbarian warrior, psyching yourself up for battle, only to see a huge armoured dog charging at you like the world's angriest kitchen appliance. Roman commanders loved these dogs. Not for their cuteness, that emotion was banned from the military, but for their ability to intimidate enemies and bite things on command. War dogs guarded camps, delivered messages, attacked intruders, and most importantly, stole food from soldiers who were already starving. A true multitasker. But it wasn't all war and violence. Romans also adored dogs at home. Wealthy families kept lapdogs with names like Fiddle, Little One, and Bitey. These tiny dogs slept on silk cushions, ate scraps from banquets, and definitely judged every guest who entered the villa. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers on the frontier shared their rations with giant shaggy dogs, who smelled like battle and potatoes. Roman farmers used dogs to guard livestock. Merchants used them to protect caravans. Even Roman priests used dogs during certain rituals, though the dogs probably had no idea why they were there and assumed it involved snacks. And of course, being Romans, they recorded everything. We have tombstones dedicated to beloved pets, complete with poetic inscriptions like, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my own hands." A level of emotion Romans rarely showed to actual humans. But the most ironic part? For all their glorification of war, conquest, and discipline, Rome still bowed, quietly, privately, to the emotional power of dogs. A dog could guard an empire. A dog could march with legions. A dog could serve in battle with courage no senator ever possessed. Yet at night, after the fighting, even the toughest Roman soldier rested easier with a dog curled at his feet. Because in Rome, as everywhere else, dogs weren't just warriors. They were family. As the Roman Empire puffed itself up across Europe, and the Greeks debated everything from ethics to the meaning of chairs, dogs were quietly doing something far more impressive, conquering the world without trying. No strategy, no legions, no diplomacy, just pause, charm, and zero understanding of borders. The moment humanity built the Silk Road, that long, dusty highway stretching from China to the Mediterranean, dogs looked at it and thought, "Nice. A walk." And off they went. Wherever merchants travelled, across deserts, mountains and cities, dogs followed, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because a merchant dropped a dumpling, sometimes because a dog woke up from a nap and realised it was 600 miles from home and simply rolled with it. Caravans heading from China to Persia had the same three constants: camels complaining, merchants complaining louder dogs, who complained about nothing but still ate the most. Dogs became the Silk Road's unofficial employees. They guarded tents at night, chased thieves, and scared off animals that wanted to eat the merchandise. Traders learned one important truth: you can trust a dog more than a business partner. Different cultures began swapping more than silk and spices. They swapped breeds. A Persian trader might meet a Chinese caravan and see a fluffy little dog and think, "My wife will either love this or throw it at me." And suddenly, Pekingese were travelling across continents like tiny, grumpy diplomats. Meanwhile, hardy shepherd dogs from Central Asia moved westward, joining nomads and guarding livestock from wolves, who hadn't read the memo that dogs were now on Team Human. Every stop on the Silk Road added another chapter. In India, dogs found temples to guard and leftovers to steal. In Persia, they protected caravans and pretended to be noble. In Central Asia, they befriended horsemen with zero fear of death. In China, they became pampered palace pets who absolutely judged everyone. Dogs didn't just spread biologically, they spread culturally. People shared stories about them. Merchants traded them. Kings demanded them as gifts. Entire populations reshaped how they saw wolves because of dogs that wandered great empires sniffing everything in sight. By the time the Silk Road reached full swing, dogs had accomplished something extraordinary. They became the first global citizens, and they did it by following people who dropped crumbs. While humans mapped trade routes, built empires, and fought over territory. Dogs simply existed. And somehow, that was enough to take over the world. As civilization got richer, fatter, and more obsessed with showing off, dogs entered a new era, the status symbol era. This was when dogs stopped being just hunters, guards, or walking alarm systems. Now they were luxury items, fashion accessories, indicators of wealth, living proof that your social standing was so high you could afford a creature that did absolutely nothing. In wealthy Greek households, owning a fancy dog was the ancient equivalent of posting a picture of your sports car on Instagram. The more exotic the breed, the more people assumed you had a ridiculous amount of money and zero real problems. Aristocrats strutted through markets with elegant, fluffy dogs at their heels, while the dogs themselves looked constantly confused by their new environment. Why are there marble statues everywhere? Why is everyone yelling about democracy? But Rome took this concept to Olympic levels. Roman nobles kept toy dogs so tiny they could fit inside sleeves. Dogs that, evolutionarily speaking, had absolutely no business existing. These miniature, trembling creatures didn't hunt, didn't guard, didn't bark effectively. Their primary job was to sit on silk pillows and look judgmental. Many succeeded. Meanwhile, professional dog breeders emerged, creating dogs specifically for wealthy households. These breeders probably invented half of the modern dog problems we still deal with today. Overbred noses, fragile bones, and anxiety disorders inherited from 1,000 generations of palace gossip. It wasn't just small dogs, though. Wealthy elites loved massive dogs too. Enormous Molossian beasts that could guard estates, intimidate rivals, and accidentally crush your furniture. Owning one was the ancient version of saying, "I have power." Also, I may die if it sits on me. Dogs also started appearing in art. Every self-respecting noble wanted their portrait painted with a dog at their side, proof of sophistication, loyalty, and emotional depth. Although based on surviving sculptures, some nobles clearly loved their dogs more than their spouses. As empire after empire adopted dog culture, one thing became clear. Dogs weren't just animals anymore. They were social markers, political statements, symbols of taste, wealth, refinement, and occasionally, delusion. The dog who once hunted mammoths now lounged in marble villas eating roasted duck. The wolf who once survived by chasing deer now survived by being adorable enough to avoid banishment. And humanity didn't mind at all. Because nothing says, "I am wealthy and important," quite like a creature who contributes nothing and still gets treated like royalty. Welcome to medieval Europe, a place where the average peasant's life expectancy hovered somewhere between "don't get your hopes up" and "the plague is coming again." If you were poor, which was everyone except 3 people, your daily routine involved working from sunrise to please no more, eating bread that could break your teeth, and trying not to catch a disease that starts with a cough and ends with burial. In this chaos, dogs became indispensable, not as luxury ornaments, not as status symbols, but as actual survival equipment. The medieval peasant had 3 lines of defense against disaster: a wooden door that didn't close properly, prayer, and a dog that barked at absolutely everything. Medieval watchdogs were not the glamorous warriors of Roman legions. They were scruffy, muddy, vaguely potato-shaped creatures who smelled like compost and bad decisions. But they were loyal, alert, and always ready to sound the alarm, even if the danger was just a leaf blowing suspiciously. These dogs roamed village fences, guarded livestock, and escorted peasants home from long days in the fields. They weren't pampered, they weren't brushed. They certainly weren't fed high-quality medieval kibble. Their diet consisted largely of table scraps, stale bread, and things they found on the ground that no one talks about. Yet, medieval peasants adored them in their own way. A dog might sleep by the hearth, a generous word for pile of burning sticks, warm the children during winter, and chase off thieves desperate enough to rob someone who owned nothing. Dogs were essentially furry housemates who kept predators at bay, wolves, foxes, or the occasional drunk knight who fell asleep in the wrong cottage. But the partnership was mutual. Dogs got warmth, a human family, and a reliable food source, even if the food tasted like disappointment. They also got affection, not fancy collars or velvet cushions, but pats on the head and a life free from pack politics. Medieval dogs worked for a living. They herded sheep, they guarded granaries, they patrolled muddy roads with the seriousness of a knight defending his honour. Except knights usually smelled better. In the hierarchy of village life, peasants sat at the bottom. But dogs? Dogs were somewhere just above peasants and below the local priest, and honestly they earned it. Because while medieval Europe battled plague, famine, taxes, raiders and more plague, these loyal animals stayed by humanity's side, barking their hopeless little barks into the darkness. And somehow, it helped. If medieval peasants had dogs for survival, medieval nobles had dogs for something far more dramatic: status, ego, and emotional support during political meltdowns. Dogs in castles lived a life so different from village dogs that you'd think they were entirely separate species. Peasant dogs slept on dirt floors. Noble dogs slept on cushions stuffed with goose feathers and the suffering of the lower classes. Castles were chaotic places. You had scheming nobles, bored knights, moody princes, and at least one suspiciously unhinged jester. Into this medieval soap opera entered the castle hound, massive, muscular, loyal, and usually better behaved than every human in the building. Nobles loved hunting, mostly because it gave them an excuse to avoid governing. Their hounds were essential for this. These dogs were trained to track boar, chase deer, and ignore the existential screams of peasants, watching their livestock vanish into the woods again. Castle hounds were serious professionals, unlike the nobles who owned them. Picture a hunting scene. A noble knight in a shiny helmet he can't see out of, a group of servants doing all the actual work, and a pack of hounds sprinting ahead thinking, "Finally, someone is letting us do our job instead of forcing us to sit through another banquet." These hounds were elite, strong, fast, loyal. They guarded castles, patrolled courtyards, and politely refrained from eating messengers, most of the time. Some castles even had entire rooms dedicated to dogs, warmer than the servants' quarters naturally. Meanwhile, noble ladies kept smaller dogs, delicate little creatures who spent their days on velvet cushions, receiving more affection than most husbands. These miniature dogs never hunted, never guarded, and never contributed anything except the occasional dramatic fainting spell. They were, in essence, medieval influencers. Dogs in the noble world were also emotional anchors. Knights heading to war hugged their dogs. Lords confided in them. Queens fed them scraps under the table during political dinners, where everyone pretended to like each other. Dogs understood palace secrets better than the royal scribes, and they could keep them too. But the real comedy? No matter how fancy their surroundings, no matter how expensive their collars, castle dogs still behaved like dogs. They chased chickens, stole bread, barked at ghosts, and refused to come when called. Because even wrapped in luxury, a dog will always be a dog. And medieval nobles needed that kind of honest chaos more than they ever admitted. By the time Europe stumbled into the Renaissance, humans had rediscovered art, science, architecture, philosophy, and, most importantly, how to spoil dogs even more than the nobility already had. This was the age of genius. Michelangelo sculpted gods. Leonardo sketched helicopters. But Renaissance nobles, they invented something truly revolutionary: the extremely pampered lapdog. In Renaissance courts, dogs experienced the kind of glow-up usually reserved for reality TV contestants. These tiny velvet pillow creatures didn't descend from wolves so much as they descended from anxiety. They trembled constantly, demanded attention, and were carried everywhere because their legs were apparently decorative. Ladies of high society adored them. A noblewoman would glide through a palace wearing 40 pounds of silk, her hair stacked higher than her social expectations, and at her side sat a 4-pound dog that looked like it hadn't hunted anything larger than a crouton in its entire life. This dog ate better than 98% of the population, and contributed absolutely nothing beyond being cute enough to justify its existence. But the Renaissance wasn't all about tiny dogs. This was also a golden age for hunting breeds. Kings and dukes bred enormous, elegant hounds designed to sprint after deer at speeds that made knights seriously rethink their cardio routines. Hunting was no longer strictly practical. It was performance art. Men in tights chasing deer while dogs did all the real work. A Renaissance aesthetic. Meanwhile, artists became obsessed with painting dogs. Portraits of noble families almost always included a dog sitting proudly at their feet, looking more dignified than half the people in the room. In these paintings, dogs symbolized loyalty, virtue, and a reminder that someone in the household had actual emotional intelligence. And then there were the weird little spaniels who sat in ladies' laps during long carriage rides, balls, banquets, political negotiations, and marriages arranged by people who absolutely shouldn't have been in charge. These dogs served a crucial Renaissance function, keeping their owners from having a public meltdown. Royal courts were full of drama, betrayal, gossip, poisoning attempts, and fashion disasters. Having a tiny dog on your lap gave you at least one reason not to flip a banquet table. But whether tiny and fluffy or tall and regal, Renaissance dogs shared one unifying truth. They had successfully risen from Ice Age scavengers to elite members of the world's fanciest households, all without doing anything except being lovable and alive. After thousands of years of chaos, evolution, cultural drama, and truly questionable grooming choices, looking at you, ancient Egypt, we arrive at the end of our journey, where dogs officially solidify their position as humanity's first and best friend. Not by conquest, not by political treaties, but by simply being the most persistent freeloaders in history. Think about it. No other species has successfully infiltrated every era, every culture, every household, every couch. Dogs did what empires failed to do. Rome collapsed, Egypt fell, the Renaissance ended. Human trends came and went. But dogs just kept showing up, tail wagging, asking for snacks. By the late Renaissance, dogs had mastered humanity. They figured out the formula. Be cute, provide emotional support. Stare intensely while humans eat. Pretend to understand commands, profit. They evolved from wolves who hunted mammoths into creatures who now panic when their owner leaves the room for 30 seconds. They went from sleeping in snowdrifts to sleeping diagonally across an entire king-sized bed, forcing humans into uncomfortable L-shapes throughout the night. And here's the secret no historian likes to admit. Dogs didn't just become our best friends. They tricked us into becoming theirs. Think about the emotional manipulation. Dogs tilt their heads. Humans melt. Dogs whine softly. Humans hand over food. Dogs look sad for 0.5 seconds. Humans apologize for existing. Meanwhile, dogs give us unconditional love, loyalty, protection, companionship, and enough fur to knit an entire medieval cloak every week. They guard us, comfort us, and greet us with the enthusiasm of someone meeting a celebrity, even when we only went outside to get the mail. And yet, the strangest, most heartwarming truth is this. Dogs chose us. They weren't forced. They weren't captured. They weren't bribed with luxury. Okay, maybe a little bribed. But from the moment that first lonely wolf sat near that first lonely fire, dogs stayed because something about humans, our warmth, our chaos, our scraps, our stubbornness, felt right to them. And humans, battling ice, famine, empires, plague, heartbreak, and bad architecture, found something in dogs they couldn't find anywhere else. Pure, uncomplicated friendship. Not political, not philosophical, not strategic. Just real. And so the greatest partnership in history wasn't written in stone tablets or royal decrees. It was written in footprints. One human, one dog, walking side by side across the centuries. From Ice Age fires to Renaissance palaces to your living room today, dogs never stopped being our companions, and we never stopped needing them. Before the Roman legions ever set foot in Gaul, before Julius Caesar sharpened his quill to complain about everyone who wasn't Roman, there existed a group of figures who commanded more influence than any chieftain or warrior. These were the Druids, the cloaked scholars of the forest, the guardians of secrets, the philosophers who somehow managed to be both terrifying and charismatic at the same time. In a world where status usually came from how loudly you could shout or how many enemies you could decapitate, Druids stood apart. Their power came not from violence, but from something Gauls regarded with even greater awe: knowledge. To the ordinary Gaul, a Druid wasn't merely a priest. He was the astronomer who charted the stars, the judge who settled tribal disputes, the political advisor who reminded kings not to be idiots, and the mystic who could read divine signs in the smoke of a ritual fire. If your tribe needed to bless an upcoming battle, negotiate peace, resolve a property dispute, or figure out why your pigs were suddenly refusing to eat, you went straight to a Druid. Not because they were friendly, many were famously stern, but because everyone agreed they were the closest thing to a direct line to the gods. Their authority was built on an education system that would make even modern PhD students weep. A Druid might study for up to 20 years, memorizing colossal amounts of legal codes, genealogies, cosmology, poetry, mythology, ritual procedures, and philosophical doctrine. And they memorized all of it without writing anything down. Not because they lacked writing, they knew Greek and Latin well enough, but because they considered sacred knowledge too important to risk being read by people who weren't ready. Also, it's an excellent way to ensure that only the truly dedicated join your order. Nothing filters out the half-hearted like being told, "Wonderful, now memorize the entire spiritual history of your people by next winter." But perhaps the most intriguing part was their presence. A Druid didn't walk. He arrived. Wrapped in woolen robes, usually white for rituals, they carried an aura of seriousness that even the rowdiest warriors respected. Kings listened to them. Entire tribes deferred to them. And when a Druid raised his hand to speak, the forest seemed to go quiet, as if the very land acknowledged their authority. They were scholars, mystics, scientists, judges, and philosophers, all wrapped in one enigmatic figure whose power flowed not from a throne, but from the depths of ancient memory. If Chapter 1 introduced the Druids as the quiet power behind Gaulish society, Chapter 2 reveals the training grounds that forged these forest philosophers, the sacred groves. These weren't your ordinary patches of trees. To the Celts, a grove wasn't just a location, it was a living classroom, a sanctuary where knowledge flowed as freely as the wind through oak leaves. And for aspiring Druids, it was where their minds were reshaped, reorganized, and occasionally broken by the sheer amount of information they were expected to memorize. Entering Druidic training was a commitment far more intense than joining a warrior band. Warriors trained to fight. Druids trained to understand everything: the stars, the laws, the gods, the seasons, medicinal herbs, moral philosophy, sacred geometry, and a terrifying amount of poetry. Their curriculum was equal parts academic, spiritual, and brutally practical. Students might spend years observing the sky to track seasonal cycles, studying the behavior of animals to interpret omens, or learning which plants cured ailments and which plants made you see glowing spirits dancing on riverbanks. But the core of their training, and the part Romans found most suspicious, was their absolute refusal to write any of this knowledge down. To the Druids, writing things was like handing out cheat codes to the universe. Sacred knowledge needed to be earned, not skimmed. As a result, memory became their most powerful tool. A Druid in training had to memorize vast oral libraries, some lasting hours or even days when recited properly. If you forgot a section, you didn't get a gentle reminder. You started again, from the beginning. Often while standing in cold fog, because Gaulish weather does not care that you're trying to become a priest. Their teachers were strict but respected. Senior Druids were the custodians of cultural memory, and they enforced discipline not through punishment, but through expectation. They saw themselves as guardians of civilization, and if you wanted to join them, You had better treat that responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. Yet their education wasn't just about storing information. It was about shaping a mind capable of interpreting the world. A druid needed to read signs in nature, understand the cycles of the cosmos, make legal judgments, advise kings, and perform rituals. Their knowledge wasn't theoretical. It had weight, consequences, and meaning. By the end of their training, a successful student emerged not just as a scholar, but as a conduit between the human world and the realm of the divine, a role only a few were ever truly prepared to carry. To outsiders, the druids looked like mysterious forest mystics. But to the Gauls themselves, druids were something far more practical. They were the backbone of justice. Long before Roman law marched across Europe wrapped in togas and bureaucracy, the druids served as the judges and arbitrators of Celtic society. If someone stole cattle, broke an oath, insulted a clan, or accidentally set fire to their neighbour's hut, because open flames and thatched roofs are a terrible combination, it was the druids who stepped in to decide the matter. Their authority as judges wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. When a druid delivered a verdict, the tribe obeyed. Even kings had to swallow their pride and accept the decision, because defying a druid wasn't merely illegal, it was unthinkable. The druids carried the weight of tradition, divine authority, and centuries of precedent in their words. And unlike Roman courts, where some clever orator could twist laws like pretzels, Celtic justice relied on memory and consensus. A druid didn't consult scrolls. He consulted centuries of oral tradition stored in his mind. Druidic law wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring balance. Their rulings focused on compensation, reconciliation, and preventing needless blood feuds. In a world where personal honour mattered as much as survival, these judgments held communities together. A single feud between families could spiral into years of chaos, and the druids acted as the brakes on that cultural catastrophe. They negotiated peace between clans, divided land, and resolved disputes in a way that preserved social harmony. They also oversaw oaths, treaties, and diplomatic agreements. When two tribes agreed to peace, a druid witnessed the pact, invoking the gods as guarantors. Breaking a promise in the presence of a druid was the ancient Gaulish equivalent of painting a massive target on your back. Not because the druid would punish you directly, but because the gods supposedly would. The Romans found this legal power unsettling. Caesar complained that druids could even forbid people from participating in rituals or gatherings, effectively exiling them spiritually. In a society built on communal identity, this was the harshest punishment imaginable. A social death sentence delivered without raising a sword. Through their judgments, the druids shaped everyday life in Gaul. They weren't simply wise old counsellors. They were the living embodiment of law and order, holding the delicate fabric of tribal society together with memory, diplomacy, and a reputation so respected that even warriors feared disappointing them. If the druids were the judges and philosophers of Gaul, they were also its ritual specialists, the ones who kept the spiritual machinery of the Celtic world running smoothly. To the Gauls, every river, hill, grove, and storm had a spirit. The universe was alive, and the druids were the only ones who knew how to communicate with it properly. Their ritual responsibilities ranged from the gentle, seasonal blessings, healing ceremonies, to the dramatic, interpreting omens in sacred fires, to the slightly terrifying, depending on which Roman author you believe. Central to druidic ritual life was the sacred calendar. The druids charted the turning of the seasons, the cycles of the moon, solstices, equinoxes, and the invisible rhythms that shaped agricultural and spiritual life. Festivals such as Samhain, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Imbolc weren't random celebrations. They were precise markers in a cosmic schedule. A festival performed too early or too late risked disturbing the harmony between the human world and the divine. So yes, if a druid showed up and told you the bonfire must be lit now, you lit it, immediately. Their rituals involved offerings to the gods, often food, crafted objects, or animals, though the Romans famously accused druids of performing human sacrifices. Caesar described wicker effigies filled with victims and set ablaze, a scene dramatic enough to make any Roman reader gasp. Whether these accounts were accurate, exaggerated, or propaganda meant to justify conquest is still debated. But one thing is clear: the Druids were deeply connected to ritual acts meant to restore balance, heal dishonor, or ensure divine favor. What Rome saw as brutality may have been, to the Gauls, a sacred duty carried out in times of crisis. Druids also oversaw augury, reading signs from